Derek was halfway through smiling when the attorney slid the stapled document across the conference table.
You could actually see the blood leave his face. His fingers stayed wrapped around the coffee cup, but he stopped blinking for a second, like his brain had hit a wall.
And then the attorney said, "This codicil changes the executor designation entirely."
But to understand how we got here, I need to take you back about 4 months earlier, to the week after Nina buried her mother.
Nina was 46, lived in Phoenix, and had spent most of the last 12 years barely speaking to her family. Not because of one dramatic fight, just erosion. Her mother always sided with Derek, and Derek always knew how to turn every conversation into a courtroom where he somehow became the victim. Still, 3 months before her mother died, Nina started visiting again. Twice a week, Wednesday dinners, Sunday coffee. The kind of reconnection people think means there's still time.
There wasn't.
Her mother died from a stroke at 2:11 in the morning on a Thursday in March.
By Friday afternoon, Derek had already introduced himself to everyone at the funeral home as the executor. Not her son, not we're grieving, executor. At first, Nina ignored it.
Then the little things started stacking up. Derek told her the estate account had about 90 grand in it. 2 weeks later, he casually mentioned market losses had dropped it to 62.
Their mother's Lexus disappeared from the driveway before probate even opened. Derek said he was storing it. Nina later saw his daughter driving it to a nail salon. And every time Nina asked for paperwork, Derek had another excuse ready. Attorneys still organizing things.
Banks being difficult.
Probate takes forever, Nina. Jesus. He always said her name like he was exhausted by it. Then came the fake updates. Every Sunday at exactly 7:14 p.m., Derek sent these long family group texts full of legal-sounding nonsense, awaiting fiduciary disbursement authorization, tax holdbacks, stuff that sounded smart until you realized none of it actually meant anything. The weirdest part? Derek wasn't some movie villain. He volunteered at church. He cried at dog movies. He once drove 6 hours because his neighbor's Deagle needed emergency surgery. And somehow that made this worse, because people like that aren't supposed to rob their own mother's estate. Nina did the reasonable thing first. She asked for an itemized accounting. Not aggressively either. She sent an email with bullet points, thanked him for handling everything, even added a smiley face she immediately regretted typing.
Derek called her 13 minutes later. "You seriously think I'm stealing from Mom?" Nina could hear his TV in the background. Baseball game. Announcer yelling about a double play, while Derek performed outrage like he'd rehearsed it in a mirror.
"I didn't say that. You implied it."
"No, I asked for paperwork."
Then came the guilt trip.
You disappear for a decade, and now suddenly you care about Mom's finances?
That landed harder than she expected.
Because estranged people always carry this invisible fear that maybe they forfeited the right to ask questions.
3 days later, Derek mailed her a packet. At first glance, it looked official. Bank balances, expense sheets, probate summaries.
Then Nina noticed something strange. 3 separate documents used different fonts for the same bank header. One even had a timestamp from a free PDF editing program still faintly visible at the bottom corner. He'd forged estate documents.
And when Nina confronted him, Derek didn't panic. He laughed, actually laughed. Then he said, "Go ahead, hire a lawyer, burn your inheritance fighting me."
And for about 2 weeks, she almost gave up, until she found the voicemail. The voicemail was old, left the day before her mother died. Nina almost deleted it because it started with 30 seconds of purse noises and coughing. Then her mother's voice came through. "Nina, call me back when you can. I changed some things with Mr. Levin today. Just, I need you to know that." That was it. 21 seconds. No explanation. But Nina replayed it 11 times. Mr. Levin was her mother's estate attorney, the same attorney Derek kept claiming was totally overwhelmed and impossible to reach. So Nina called the office herself. Reception said Mr. Levin was in Europe. Derek had apparently been handling communication. That phrase sat wrong in her stomach.
because if Derek controlled communication, then he controlled information, and if he controlled information, he controlled reality.
Nina hired a probate litigator named Sandra Pike, a woman who looked permanently annoyed by humanity in general. First meeting, Sandra flipped through Derek's paperwork for maybe 4 minutes before saying, "Your brother's either incompetent or committing fraud. Usually it's both." That was the first moment Nina felt sane again.
Sandra started digging. The estate account showed unexplained withdrawals: $8,400, $11,200, another $6,900 labeled property maintenance. The property was a paid-off suburban ranch house with no pool and grass that barely qualified as alive. Then came the bigger discovery. Derek had listed jewelry as missing, specifically their mother's sapphire bracelet and diamond earrings. Except Nina had photos from Easter dinner, 9 days before her mother died, and both pieces were visible on her mother's wrist and ears.
Sandra leaned back in her chair and said, "Your brother's getting sloppy." But Derek still had legal authority as executor, which meant every day they waited, more money could disappear. That's when Nina made the decision that scared her most.
She stopped trying to preserve the relationship. Sandra filed a petition to compel full accounting and remove Derek as executor.
But the real play was smaller, almost stupidly small. Sandra asked Nina to request one specific thing during the emergency probate hearing: direct confirmation from Mr. Levin regarding the mother's final estate amendments. Not the contents, just confirmation. At first, Nina didn't understand why that mattered.
Then Sandra explained something Derek apparently didn't know. Mr. Levin had been unreachable because he'd extended his Europe trip after a mild heart attack in Florence. Which sounds fake, but rich estate attorneys apparently collapse in Italy like it's a hobby. And before leaving the country, Levin had placed all unsigned estate amendments into temporary archive storage. But signed amendments, those stayed active in a separate secured file. Sandra thought Derek never bothered checking whether any late changes existed because he assumed he already controlled the attorney communication. One tiny detail mattered. The codicil had been witnessed by Mr. Levin's paralegal, instead of the usual office assistant, because the assistant had called in sick that day with food poisoning from gas station sushi. Sandra literally circled that note in red ink. At the time, Nina thought it sounded meaningless. It wasn't. The hearing lasted maybe 19 minutes before everything cracked open. Derek arrived confident, gray suit, blue tie, carrying 3 binders like a guy auditioning to play responsible son number 1 in a pharmaceutical commercial.
Nina noticed he kept tapping his wedding ring against the table. Fast, metallic, constant. Sandra stayed quiet almost the entire hearing.
Then she asked the judge for direct confirmation regarding any final testamentary amendments filed prior to death. Derek interrupted immediately. There were no amendments. Too fast. That mattered. Because 30 seconds later, the courtroom clerk patched Mr. Levin into the hearing remotely. The old attorney sounded exhausted, but very clear. "Yes," he said. "Mrs. Holloway executed a codicil approximately 3 weeks before her death."
Derek physically froze, not metaphorically, actually froze. His shoulders locked up first, then his jaw tightened so hard you could see the muscle twitch near his ear.
And then came the part nobody expected. The paralegal testified that Mrs. Holloway specifically requested executor reassignment because she was concerned Derek might mishandle financial discretion. That gas station sushi detail? It mattered because the substitute paralegal remembered the signing vividly. She'd only filled in that one day all month.
Derek tried interrupting again. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Then Sandra introduced the forged PDFs, and suddenly Derek wasn't leaning back anymore. He was hunched forward, rubbing both palms against his thighs, like he was trying to wipe something off his skin. The judge removed him as executor before lunch. By the following month, forensic accounting recovered about 60% of the missing assets. The jewelry turned up in Derek's wife's safe deposit box, which is an incredibly bold place to hide stolen family heirlooms, honestly. That's like hiding a body in your own garage and acting shocked when people look there. Derek avoided criminal charges after agreeing to financial restitution and surrendering executor authority permanently. Most extended families stopped speaking to him within the year. The church volunteer board quietly asked him to resign.
Nina sold the house 6 months later, kept the sapphire bracelet, and moved back to Phoenix. She and Derek have not spoken since the hearing. Nina told me the strangest part wasn't losing her brother.
It was realizing she'd actually lost him years earlier and just kept interacting with the version of him she hoped still existed. I think a lot of adults understand that feeling now.
You reach a certain age and start noticing how many relationships survive almost entirely on memory, not reality, memory. And sometimes the final argument isn't explosive or dramatic.
Sometimes it's just paperwork, and one person finally deciding they're done pretending not to see what's right in front of them.
Nina said the last thing she ever mailed Derek was a cashier's check for exactly $38.17, his share of an old utility overpayment discovered during probate.
No note, no message, just the amount he was owed. Nothing more.